to Centennial Advisors. We use our cutting-edge technology and collaborative client-focused brokerage team to provide the highest level of professional service at all stages of our clients' investments. Our team has decades of experience in all types of markets, guiding clients through some of the most challenging times for investors. Our all-hands-on-deck approach generates more offers on your listing, and according to CoStar, we have sold our listings faster and with the highest list-to-close percentages over the past 2 years. For buyers, we identify and negotiate the best terms possible, ensuring your long-term success. We hope your time with us today helps your passive investments become massive investments. Centennial Advisors, here for you now and always.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Justin White, Managing Partner of Centennial Advisors. I'm joined today by Jason Brooks of Buckhalter as my regular guest on this webinar. Jason, it's great to have you today. How are you doing?
Doing well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Our plan today for everybody is to talk a little bit about the, let's call it buy or lease conundrum for people that use commercial space, whether it's retail, office, industrial. Taking a look at what the different pros and cons and times of doing that are. We've got a couple of examples of when it might be better to lease as well as when it might be better to buy. We'll talk about some of those things, talk about some of those opportunities, the challenges that people face. And then as we kind of did a couple weeks ago when we talked, we'll probably jump into a couple topics that are just facing the real estate industry and the commercial real estate markets right now. There's a bunch of change and a bunch of newsworthy topics that are kind of good to discuss and good to get everybody's opinion. But Jason, maybe we'll start. I'll ask you a quick question. What are you seeing in the marketplace and how's everything going on your end?
I think deals are starting to pick up again. I think things are starting to move. I think interest rates have come down a bit, and there's, I think, less than the fact that they've come down. I think everything is kind of settled out for a while. So people that want to transact have a decent understanding of what the market will seemingly look like for the next period of time. And so we have started to see more transactions start to pop up. Less distress than I thought there would be to this point, but the distress is out there seemingly mostly in Class A and large office buildings, some retail, but on the larger scale retail, not strip center. Those two seem to be the things that are being the most affected right now.
And we'll get into that a little bit later, but one of the things you talk about was the market starting to pick up, interest rates starting to stabilize, and people returning back to the market. That's going to lead a number of people to transact, probably some sellers that have owned a piece of real estate for their business for years that are looking to retire, as well as a lot of newer or younger businesses looking to grow and expand and find a permanent home. So why don't we get into it? Jason, why don't we first talk, when your clients are considering acquiring some real estate, they've been in business a while, and now they're starting to acquire some real estate for that business. What are some of the pros of buying? We'll go over the pros and cons of both buying and leasing, and then we'll talk about a couple examples and dig a little deeper. You want to talk about what they like or what they consider and why they do buy?
Sure. I think the first and foremost is, they are, instead of paying a landlord for rent, they're essentially building equity. Their business is helping them build net worth over time. And why that's fascinating is, a lot of folks use that or see that over time as, a form of their retirement, whether they keep the building and rent it out when they retire or, are able to sell the building and have that, built up equity towards their retirement. I also think that it's a way when you own the building, and if you have a loan on the building and the business is making money and you pay rent, that actually lowers your profit. So it lowers your taxable income to the business, and you're lowering your taxable income while building your net worth at the same time by paying that rent, and then that rent pays down the loan. So that is, I think, maybe the biggest thing that I see. I also think when you need or want to custom build a space for your business. So if you have a high specialty business, custom building that space, it might be hard to convince a landlord to do so at times. So you're able to do that there. And I think also people that understand how financing and leverage works, you can actually get higher financing or better financing and higher leverage through certain loan programs if it's going to be an owner occupied, business property.
You know what? We may come to that later, but you brought it up, and I want you to maybe make that comment or go into a little bit more detail now. Because in addition to the things that you said, which I thought were fantastic observations, one of the benefits of actually owning the real estate is when you do want to finance later to grow the business or whatever, usually the real estate is the most secure asset that you have, and you can utilize it to grow the business, maybe cheaper than utilizing the business. Go into a little more detail on that. Talk about that some more.
Sure. So, oftentimes business loans are considered riskier by banks, especially for small businesses. But real estate secured loans are less risky because, in theory, they could foreclose on the property and take it back to pay themselves. So, if you needed to, let's say you bought a building, and even on the acquisition, you can get a larger loan to value, better rates, even in today's market. You pay that loan down over time, and now all of a sudden you want to expand to a second or third location, or you want to buy the building next door. You can actually, in a more efficient way, borrow money against your real estate, which you can then use to acquire another property. And then again, go back into that cycle of paying yourself rent. The rent pays down the debt. Well, when you borrow and utilize that money, that borrowed money that you though go buy another building with or another company is actually tax free when you borrow it. So there's another savings there as well. It's not like you had to sell something, pay taxes, use the post-tax capital to then buy something. So it's a really efficient way. It's just in kind of like what a lot of our clients do when they buy an apartment building or whatever, and they pay it down over time. And when they refi out cash, instead of selling the building, they refi out cash and go buy another building. It's similar, but instead of buying another building, you're just using it for your business.
Fantastic points. Thanks, Jason. Let's talk about, we'll move on to the cons of buying. I think in a nutshell, it's pretty simple. It's a bigger use of your capital, and sometimes that's a risky thing. Why don't you talk a little bit about the different places where there is, let's call it more use of somebody's capital. I think easy one is somebody goes, well, I got to make a down payment, but there's a few things even in addition to that people might not be thinking about that are additional costs or monetary obligations when you do own the real estate.
Sure. So, I think the first and foremost is how much capital you have tied up in, let's just call it your down payment. For example, many people ask, why doesn't, Starbucks has plenty of money. Why does Starbucks let somebody build a building for them? And why does, they don't own it and they let somebody else own it and they just pay rent as a tenant? And it's mostly because their business isn't the business of owning real estate. Some companies have operated that way. I think McDonald's famously started out that way. I think Ray Kroc said at Harvard Business School, something along the lines of, I'm in the real estate business, but I happen to make good hamburgers. And so that's how some people choose to think about it. But if you look at Amazon, they still rent warehouses and other situations. And I think it's because the amount of capital that they have to tie up for the down payment, they think that they can more efficiently use other places to grow and expand the business. So that's the first kind of negative. I think that's the biggest holdback for folks is in buying their building is, putting in that much capital into a down payment where it's kind of locked and tied up. Other costs, carrying costs for your financing. So the interest, depending on how your lease is structured, you might have to be paying property taxes when you wouldn't have to in your lease. You might have to carry additional insurance, building maintenance that you wouldn't have to do. So it's just the day-to-day maintenance and operations of the building. Again, if you own the building yourself, though, those all become expenses, which lower your income and lower your profit. So there's a nice offset if you do own the building, but they are also cash requirements. So if cash constraints are an issue for the business, it might not be the best idea.
You kind of covered it as we talk about what would then ultimately be the pros of leasing as you used Amazon and Starbucks. Really just talking about flexibility. And I think that's probably the biggest pro of leasing is that you have a lot more flexibility to grow your business, to move, to change locations, especially if, you're in a spot that is, you're satisfied with, but your business could really benefit from being at the corner of Main and Main or whatever it may be. That leasing gives you the flexibility to jump on that opportunity a little bit more when that opportunity arises. Let's let's move on, Jason, talk a little bit about when somebody owns their building. Let's talk about structure and things that they should be doing if they are going to own their building, what they, question we get asked often, should I own it in the name of the business, things like that. Like, what do you advise your clients when it comes to when they make the decision that from a cost standpoint, from a utilization standpoint, buying the property is the better move than leasing? How do you recommend they structure that transaction?
So I think you should have them in two completely separate entities, unless financing requires it a different way. The reason being is it's almost a little bit like separation of church and state. If you go to sell the business, which I'll talk about in a minute, it makes life a lot easier. But you can, if you have it all owned by the same entity, from a liability perspective, if something happens at the business, then you get sued. And let's say the value of the assets in the business after all the obligations have been paid off is $1 million. Your kind of cap on liability is about $1 million. If you have the property owned by that, all of your equity could also be, attacked as part of, some form of liability where it could be used to pay down, any obligations that are owed. So if you keep it separate and anything ever happens at the business, you still own the real estate, and it can't be, it's a limitation of liability through separation of the assets. So that's what I would generally recommend. It's also beneficial from an accounting perspective because, and again, you can consult your CPA, but generally from what I understand with my clients, you can write off building expenses, real estate related expenses to the real estate entity. And then there's additional expenses that like the lease expenses are write offable to the business that is operating within the space. So there's a bunch of positive financial reasons to separate the two apart.
I also think from maybe a flexibility standpoint of how somebody wants to use their money when they get near retirement, either from operating the business or owning the real estate, having them in separate entities allows for a lot more flexibility to utilize that money or to diversify that money in different places.
To that point, Justin, when you go to sell, if they're all owned in the same thing, but in the same entity, but you're keeping the real estate and you want to actually sell the business, not just the assets of the business, then again, you're essentially needing to find a way to move a major asset out of the business, which could create a taxable event by moving it to a different location. And then you're selling, one thing, but not selling the other. And so it does become much cleaner as you get to that point.
Maybe also, and this is question, Jason. So let's say I did have them and I'm in California. I have them in the same entity, the business and the real estate. And I've owned the property 20, 25 years and I want to sell the business. So I deed the real estate to a new entity or to my trust. How would that affect my property taxes?
So if we do it right, it shouldn't. There are exemptions under which you can transfer. There's an exemption in all the counties in the state of California that if the ownership before and after the transfer is substantially the same. So in theory, let's say your trust, Justin, owned Centennial Advisors and Centennial owned the building that you're in as well. As long as we transferred it to an LLC where your trust owned the LLC that owned the real estate, and we could show that the trust was essentially the same owner before and after, it's transfer tax exempt and it's property tax reassessment exempt, but you have to be careful to do it the right way.
So I'm going to ask you to almost go into that explanation, but from a different point of view. I'm sure everybody appreciates that you were trying to find the opportunity where the property tax amount might stay the same, but talk about how small maybe the difference or the nuance could be that would result in a property tax change, because I think that knowing those scenarios will also help people plan better if they are going to go down the road of one entity and things like that.
Sure. So if you do it incorrectly, let's just say it doesn't go the way you're supposed to, or you try to follow the way I recommended and it doesn't pass the audit because something was done incorrectly, your property taxes get reassessed to market. So if you bought the building 30 years ago, all of a sudden your property taxes are going to get reassessed to market, and you have to pay transfer tax, which depending on the location, I think we'll just call it roughly at 1.25% of the value. And I've never seen it. I mean, knock on wood, I haven't seen it go sideways yet. So I don't know how, if they determine the value as the new property tax basis value and they charge you that, or how they determine the value for that transfer tax. But I would assume it has something to do with what they're reassessing your basis for the property taxes is.
So maybe I give you an example. Like, I start my business 20 years ago.
Sure.
My brother makes a small investment in the down payment, or, to start up the business. And so always has been on, been a part of the business ownership. But, down the road, I want to put all the real estate in the name of my trust. Would I have an issue?
It it depends on how much he owns. It says substantially all. To be safe, what you should do is transfer it into an LLC where the same percentages. So let's just say your brother owned 5%, that he owned 5, and then you own 95 at the time of transfer, and then let it season for a bit, and then you could find a way to buy him out or come to some sort of agreement where you change and amend the operating agreement down the road. But I would recommend. I don't like to mess with the percentages. I mean, the law says substantially the same. I don't think there's a clear definition of substantially. And I think when cities are looking for tax revenue, substantially means whatever they feel like that day. So I would stick with trying to keep it exactly as it is.
All right. Before we get to kind of what people should do when they're done with the business, in both a buying, what the pros and cons are of buying and leasing, I want you to go back to expand on something a little bit. So talk for a minute about sale leaseback financing. And I guess the first maybe part of the question is, we talked about Starbucks, or you and I deal with a lot of corporate tenants that acquire a series of stores, or they expand their footprint, and then they do sale leasebacks to fund further growth. First, just maybe give some examples and talk about that strategy. And then I want you to talk about how you could see more of the smaller businesses we work with, how they could somewhat utilize a similar strategy to grow their footprint. So talk a little bit about sale leaseback as a vehicle to grow somebody's business.
Sure. So we'll give an example. There's some large franchisees for some of the QSR restaurants. Like, I think, Justin, we've done a couple of Taco Bells with a company that does this themselves. We've done some Arby's, I think, in Texas. And so what some of the companies do. So, well, first I'll talk about what the really big companies like Starbucks does. Starbucks has a preferred set of 1 to 3 developers in each region. The acquisition team at Starbucks says, we want a place here. This developer has a relationship with Starbucks. They go in and they get to build the property to a certain cap rate on their cost side. So let's call it a 7 cap on the cost side for them. But then they'll go out in the market and sell it at a 5 cap. And so Starbucks will commit to a lease X amount of time. They work with the same developer over. The developer has the specs, works with the city, works with the county, gets everything approved, builds it, gets it open, and then sells it to a retail investor on the open market or a REIT. Those developers are making such large profits in the deals that it doesn't really make sense for them to continue to hold it, right? They're just trying to grow their capital by doing a bunch of deals and selling them and growing them. And for Starbucks, it doesn't make sense to have, $400,000 or $500,000 tied up in a store opening or $1 million tied up in a store opening when they can have $100,000 tied up in a store opening, and they're going to make just as much money on the cash flow. So that's a Starbucks. Then there's some larger franchisees we're talking about with Arby's or Taco Bell that I get the opportunity to move into a market. They identify their own location because they want to make sure that they get the location they want, but they're not in the business of owning and holding the real estate. They do have a construction arm that allows them to go at their own speed as fast as they can at their pace, get it done. They know the specs and they get to pick their area. They build it for themselves. They sign the lease. And then as soon as it's done, they'll sell it and then just become the tenant. Because again, the amount of capital that they have tied up in that deal might be $700,000, but they could open up 4 stores with that same amount of money. And those 4 stores are making more than the lease payment costs them. So they really do it for efficiency so that they can get their stores open faster, and they're relying on themselves and get to really pick the location that they want the best.
So Jason, we've got a client that's a retailer. They own and operate Kick and Crab, which is a fairly popular restaurant, and has been growing. A couple years ago, we got to work with them in the acquisition of a site that they put a store in Long Beach. They've been there. They've established good performance. How could they use the sale leaseback to continue to grow the brand at a rapid rate? Like, kind of go into detail of what that looks like and how they could repeat that process like a larger company.
Sure. So in theory now, right, they have a bunch of equity, not just the equity actual cash they put in, but the equity that they've built up stored into that property. So let's say that it cost them $1 million to build and they put in, $500,000 in equity and they got $500,000 in debt. Well, now the building's worth $3 million. So now they have $2.5 million in equity. That they could sell that property, right? Sign a lease that makes the property worth $3 million on a cap rate basis, sell that property and 1031 exchange if they wanted to. By the way, another reason to build the properties in one LLC and then have the tenant be a different LLC so that the tenant can remain as the entity, and then the development entity can 1031 exchange it. They could take that same equity in theory and build 5 more locations instead of owning that one piece of real estate. They could now expand and create 5 more stores. So they could go in theory from 1 to 6 with the equity that they've built up into that property.
And then you do the math, you go from 6 to 36. Yeah. You can grow quickly, utilizing your brand and your success to make the real estate, the value of the lease more valuable, and then continue to grow and make higher margin in what you do better.
Well, and it's kind of like the snowball effect, right? As you grow, your debt to build the stuff will be lower. Your cap rates will be lower. So you're going to get more value for the sale of your property, right? And all of a sudden it starts to grow and accelerate on itself because the more locations and units you have successfully operating, the more stable you're considered. And therefore, the better borrower you become, the better credit tenant you become. So the more you can demand on both like an interest rate side and on a cap rate side on the lease on the sale. So
the better real estate you have access to, there's so many things that are that positive feedback loop.
Well, then to your point, you get these new shopping centers or other places that have these pads and they come to you and say, we'd really like you to be in here instead of you having to, and they might give you a little bit better of a deal, or at least they'll come and pick you and you're not in a bidding war for the property. They just say, this is yours at this price, go for it. So there's some real advantages.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably over the course of both of our careers, we've seen that opportunity for brands like, Starbucks, while they're a big leaser of space, like, 20 years ago, Starbucks was trying to get any, let's call it B location or better, to occupy the corner. And, I want to say maybe it's 15, 18 years ago now, they absolutely started to have drive-throughs. And now they've got it, now their locations are A+ with a drive-through or a double drive-through. And we've kind of seen that evolution as they've grown the brand and become more dominant, get higher quality real estate as a result of it.
And I've even seen them start to pivot in some locations to almost a Dutch Brothers. There's dual drive-throughs. You can walk up to a window and order and pick up, but there's no place to go inside. I mean, I think they're starting to really work on their efficiency and realizing that, not as many people come into the store and they don't need all this place for you to sit and get your free Wi-Fi and do your work. Like you just come for the coffee and you get the coffee and you leave. So, I think to that point, it's, Chipotle, I think I was in law school and Chipotle really started to take off. And I just remember because the founders went to the same law school I did, but they were about 8 years older. It started in Denver, I think it was. And now everybody's like, I'd love to own a Chipotle. Right. I'd love to own, some of these other locations that are just, it makes sense. So.
Oh, I remember first going to Chipotle's, they were in like middle space in a shopping center. Yeah. Now they've got the Chipotle lane or whatever they call it. That's their drive-through and mobile. It's one of the neat things we've seen, and seen people grow. You and I talk a lot about opportunity zones. I thought it would be an interesting question for you. today. So how can someone incorporate opportunity zone benefits into acquisition for their business or new business?
Sure. So, I mean, if you, it's actually a really interesting question. So there's a real estate answer to this and a business answer to this. On the real estate side, if you have capital gain and you have a property that you want to build your, new space on, whether it's a warehouse, an engineering facility, whatever it is, that's in an OZ, and you have those capital gains, you could actually set up your own OZ fund, build it for yourself, lease it out to the company as the tenant, and then get the OZ benefits over the next, 10 to 23 years now. That's one part of it. Now, what most people don't talk about, or what we don't talk about, sorry, people talk about it, but we don't talk about, is the QOZB, or the opportunity zone businesses. If you are substantially located as a business in an opportunity zone and you set up your business with capital gains, you actually get the same benefits when you go to sell the business of, no tax and some of those other things on the sale. So if in theory you could set up your business in the opportunity zone in your opportunity zone building, and then when you sold the business or the building, you would get the benefits.
And that actually, if somebody, let's say I've got a successful business, and there's an opportunity.
I can't hear you.
Say that again. I've got an opportunity zone, or I've got a business and I want to expand and grow. I can open a new location or under my same entity, or do I have to create a new entity to open that opportunity zone business?
Say that one more time. I couldn't hear you.
I was saying, you just described it. If I was going to buy the building and I'd get both opportunity zone business and opportunity zone real property benefits. But let's say somebody is actually just like leasing works better for them. If I'm going to go and open another location, can I open it in the same entity, or should I open it in a different entity to be able to get the opportunity zone business benefits?
I would open it in a new entity, because there has to be certain language in your QOZB, your qualified opportunity zone business operating documents, like your LLC, your operating agreement has to have specific language qualifying it as a QOZB. So you would open up a new entity there.
So although like you said, we talk a lot about opportunity zone benefit on the real property side, equally for somebody who has this debate, if an opportunity zone is the desired location, whether they buy or lease, there's opportunity to get some of the opportunity zone benefits and build some wealth that way.
True. On the business side, if you're leasing or buying, you could do that, and you could do it in either situation.
Okay. Next question. Somebody's going to buy a property for their business, and they get the opportunity to buy a building pre-certificate of occupancy. What are some of the things that their attorneys have to be concerned about beyond a more traditional transaction?
If you were buying it for an OZ?
No, not in an OZ. I'm just buying a pre-certificate of occupancy. There's a developer who's got the perfect location, and I want to buy it and put my business in there for the next 20 years, but they're not done with it.
So there's a couple different things. Depending on if you close before or after C of O. If you close before C of O, first, you need to have either construction holdbacks or contingencies or financial incentives in place to make sure that the certificate of occupancy is obtained. What you don't want to do is give the developer all their money or so much money where they're disincentivized to make sure the property gets finished. In California,
how do you do that?
So it's in the purchase agreement. It's in the contract. We either do like an escrow holdback agreement or a construction holdback agreement, or, oftentimes if we're putting up, in these situations, it's a little harder to finance with debt. So this would be more of a cash situation. You put up the money in escrow, and then you can have milestones set and have the money released as those milestones are hit. I think that's the best way to do it. And we've done this before in other transactions. We actually did a transaction together, Justin, where we incentivized the seller with additional, they were incentivized to complete by a certain date. If they did, they got X amount of dollars. And if they missed it, we actually got a better purchase price. So there's ways to structure it, whether there's milestones, you're releasing capital at a certain time. And then remember too, in California, if we're just going to talk about California specifically, um, California has a at minimum 1 year workmanship warranty. So post the C of O, any problems, the developer, the general contractor, whoever built the property has to come back and fix them for a year. So you can do, post closing, in addition to getting C of O, you can do holdback monies for, if you have a punch list of items that need to be finished in case you walk through and you don't like the paint color, or, the voltage was installed incorrectly, or you have 3 volt, or what is it called, the 3-way power that's like really popular now in a lot of the big buildings. So that's not the most sophisticated usage of the term, but you know what I'm talking about. So
so I guess in short, while there's some different things, it sounds like from your perspective and your experience doing this, that's not necessarily an option that you need to avoid, because it usually turns out, let's call it bad for the buyer, that there's plenty of things that you can put in place to make sure you're protected and ultimately get to be that first person that moves in and own it, pre-certificate of occupancy.
3-phase was what I was looking for in my power discussion there. 3-phase, but yes, we've done this enough times where I feel really confident closing pre-C of O and making sure the client's protected. So it's not a big deal. I think it's more important if you find the right property to either get it tied up or to close on it. So,
well, you are a fantastic attorney. I will not be calling you for any electrical work.
That's fine, but it's 3-phase is the power that I was looking for.
So now let's talk about, we've talked about a bunch of different ways that people can utilize buying and leasing to grow their business and different options. Somebody's going to be successful at it. They're going to do maybe one or both along the way over the course of their business ownership. But what do they do when they're done? Talk about obviously leasing is probably a little bit easier, but in buying, maybe walk through some of what, you think are the recommendations are for somebody if they do own their real estate and their business, and how that's different than if they just lease it.
Sure. So if you own it, you kind of have 2 choices. One, well, I guess let's first start. If you close your business and you just shut it down, you have no tenant for the space. So then you have the choice of either selling the building or finding a tenant for the space and just solely serving as the landlord. Now, when you sell the business, you could, in theory, sell the building as well. But oftentimes you would just sell the business and the buyer will sign a new lease at the property. That new lease then just makes you a landlord and you can collect rent. And we have many clients that have sold businesses in the last few years that continue to own the real estate, and the buyer just serves as their tenant and they collect their rent checks every month. And that's separate from the big lump sum they got for selling the business. But then again, if you have a commercial property with a good tenant in it, you can pretty much liquidate it at any time as long as you're willing to price it reasonably in the given market. So I like that it's kind of like your passive cash flow in retirement from that perspective.
Talk for a second, though, about whether somebody, if they own their business and their real estate, certainly they have options, right? Sell the real estate, sell the business, sell them together, or sell the real estate first, sell the business first, sell them together. Talk about pros and cons of maybe the together or a stepped process.
Sure. So if you sell them together, you could you get to kind of choose the allocation of values when you sell businesses, right? So when you sell businesses, you allocate the value to different assets. Well, you could, in theory, allocate a lot of value to the real estate, and then give yourself more 1031 exchange money if you wanted to kick the tax can down the road, or if you knew that you had, a lot of write-offs towards the business, you could allocate a little less to the real estate, a little more to the business. So when you sell them together, you can do some interesting things from a tax perspective through value allocations. If you sell them separately, it allows you to, let's say, have a taxable event in 1 year. If you sell the business, let's say this year, and then if you sell the real estate a couple years later, and let's say you're not going to exchange, you have a taxable event the fall 2 years later, 3 years later, whenever you sell it. you will have a lower tax bill because, as people know, taxes, escalate in tiers. And so if you sell it all at one shot, you're going to have more capital in the highest tier. You'll pay more taxes.
Some fantastic insight there, Jason, onto the tax, how to utilize that best for somebody's situation. I think that plays into it. One of the additional parts that we often advise people on is certainly they need to look at the benefits of doing it together. But somebody who wants to buy the business and the person who pays the most for the business and the person who pays the most for the real estate are not often the same people. And so when you do transact them separately, whether it's business first or real estate first after you've put a long-term lease on the business, is that you have a larger buyer pool for each individual asset than you do with them combined. And when you have a larger buyer pool, you get more competition. You usually have higher net proceeds as a result. A lot of our clients who don't, I would say, plan for their retirement and disposition and just kind of one day decide it, usually work hastily. They sell them together, and whether it's the real estate or the business, the buyer ultimately got a pretty significant discount because one of them was somewhat thrown into the deal just to make it happen quicker. Any comments or any additional that you want to share on that?
No, I think that's fair. I just think oftentimes you have real estate owners and then you have operating business owners, to your point, and people are one or the other. So you're not going to maximize the value of each if someone's buying both at the same time.
I think in conclusion, or before we show you a couple of examples here, it's really there's pros and cons to both. And a lot of it depends on utilization, where you're at, what you're trying to accomplish. And then the second component is just the financial aspects of it. And what we've got here is we've got two different examples that we're going to show you. This would be a industrial asset in Signal Hill, where we compare the total cost of leasing and buying. And you can see that in this case, because of where sales price is relative to where lease rates are, it would take until year 15 before leasing costs somebody more than buying would. And we see that oftentimes when, the lease rate relative to the sales price per foot is pretty significant. So, this example, certainly Signal Hill, one of the, Signal Hill and industrial, one of the best industrial markets in Southern California right now, where vacancy sub 2%, huge high demand for people, especially when you can get some, parking for some trucks, that the cost to buy that very high relative to the lease rate. And this, if you signed a long-term lease for, at least the first 10 years or 14 years of that lease, you'd end up saving a lot of money by doing leasing. We'll show you a different example. And this, kind of a good example of
Justin, on that last one, how does that help? Like, over time, obviously buying is expensive early on. Are they building more net worth to that though? Or does that cost at least helping pay down a loan or debt? Is it more valuable to them there? How does that work?
So what we do when we look at this is we take a look at the capital that you'd use, what the lease payments are. And then we also look at what the capital that you would use to buy and the associated appreciation with that. But we also look at if you didn't buy and you used the money to invest in your business and grow your business, or you used it to invest in something else, which one net at the end of the day puts more money in your pocket? Leasing versus buying. Okay. So when you do these, I think the best way is to factor, the use of the dollars, as well as, whatever the pros or cons might be immediately of the payment, leasing versus buying.
That's great. Go to the next one. I'm just trying to figure out the way through it and how you guys look at it, because there's so many factors that go into it, but it's very fascinating.
This one you look at over the course of time, and this is an office building in Tustin. Certainly office, maybe a little less demand, although my quick comment would be, I think suburban office is a totally different animal in today's market than the Class A towers in a downtown or in a business center. But in this one, you can see over a 15-year period at every kind of marker that we look at, buying the property would be a more effective use of somebody's money than leasing the space. So we include these and want to show these because, you know, just like your needs as it relates to your growth or what you're looking for, also it can, you know, depend whether buying or leasing is a better choice. The numbers and where lease rates are relative to price points can also be a key factor to consider when we look at these. And when we sit down and work with clients that are interested in new space or interested in exploring whether they should buy their current space or continue to lease, all of these factors go into it. We sit down, we'll ask a lot of those questions that Jason kind of made comments on, or the considerations that he thought everybody should, you know, look at before they decide whether they want to buy or lease. We do all that, and then we look at the numbers and come back and kind of sit down with our clients and ultimately help them determine what is the right thing to do. The nice part about this is whether it's non-financial considerations or the financial considerations, you don't have to just kind of guess and hope that you pick the right option. When you work with us or when you work with professionals in this space, we can really figure out, based on all the things that you say and your capital situation, what is the best scenario at any given moment. What to do today might be different than what your business should do 5 years or 7 years or 10 years down the road. And we can help you factor all those things into it, including what would be the right disposition strategy. Jason, before we spend the last few minutes talking about some of the things that we're also seeing out in the marketplace, any last comments on the buy lease question or suggestions that you have for people?
No, I think it's just worth, if this is something you're considering, worth sitting down with an advisor, right? Like you might be really good at operating your business, whether it's an engineering business or, you know, a shipping company, but you might not be as proficient on the real estate side of things. So I think sitting down with an expert, one of the advisors, will make your life a lot easier from this analysis perspective. So I think it's just worth a phone call, and, you know, you'll learn quickly which one works best for you.
So let's move on for a little bit. Let's spend a couple minutes talking about some of the newsworthy things out there. What's the post-mansion tax buzz that you're hearing? Give everybody the 30-second mansion tax for anybody who hasn't been on some of our calls recently.
30-second overview. It was ULA is what it was called. It was voted on in city of Los Angeles. What it said is any property, although they called it the mansion tax, it was any property sold over $5 million had an additional 4% sales tax due at closing, whether or not you made or lost money. It was kind of like a transfer tax or a recording tax or any of those. Anything over $10 million is a 5.5% tax. And so it's been pretty significant. We did a bunch of very expensive houses within 3-day close periods at the very end of March because it became effective on April 1st.
So what was the biggest tax savings? March 30 close as opposed to April 4.
There were multiple 7-figure tax savings. Multiple $20 to $40 million properties. So.
And this is not a LA only across the country sort of thing. We're seeing this in other cities.
It's currently in LA City, but there's places that have been talking about it. I think it came up recently in New York is talking about it. I'm sure that means San Francisco will try to do it. But interestingly, now to your question. So the LA City treasurer came out and told the city, don't spend the money. He said, you can collect the money, you can hold the money, but I wouldn't recommend spending the money, which tells you that there are some signals on the political front that it's going to get overturned. Now, interestingly, as far as I understand and what we're hearing, it's not going to be overturned in a court. but that the state is looking at issuing a referendum that those sort of taxes are not legal in the state of California. So essentially, potentially Gavin Newsom and the state legislature are going to pass a law that those aren't valid taxes, that you cannot do that. And a state law would trump the local law in that situation. And so it would overturn the tax.
When the state does that, is the state just going to say that's a state issue and then the state's going to tax?
In theory,
in every part of that answer, the part that was most shocking to me was that the state was going to overturn it.
Yes, that got me too. But they're talking about the big buzz. Yes, it's being challenged in courts and it could get overturned in courts. But there's also a big push. There's a state referendum on the table to overturn it as a law, right? So if it gets overturned in the court, you could go back and you could try to structure or pass the law in a different way to, get around the reasonings the court said that this isn't allowed. But if the state officials pass a law, you can't then structure it in a different way because the law says it's unallowable.
I'm still.
Yes, I'm shocked too. I
still keep thinking that the state's going to overturn this because I think so much of what we see in proposals that are going to come to the population of California is to overturn Prop 13, increase property taxes on higher
split roll.
The idea of rolling back a tax just is shocking to me.
But I find it interesting, right? Because right now you have a city tax in some cities, you have a county tax. Maybe the state's going to overturn additional city taxes and then pass a state tax. It'll get really interesting, and then you might have a city sue a state, and then it could be pretty fast.
Maybe people didn't hear it here first, but I have a feeling that we down the road are going to talk about a state transfer tax.
Probably.
Just saying, mark it. 4/20/2023, 447. We called the state transfer tax.
Well, and think about it, because Prop 13, all of those local taxes, they mostly property taxes mostly deal with the local level stuff. So the state's in a financial deficit and they need to generate revenue. And it's not like they can raise the income tax much more than it is. I mean, I guess they could, but.
Okay, I could talk about this one for the next 13 minutes, but I'll move on. But one of the things that might do, unless it just gets overturned by the state and doesn't increase anywhere, but should the state do it or taxes continue to increase, that's going to continue to kind of lead to potentially people moving out of state. Your firm has been expanding in a lot of places out of California, in addition to growth in California. Are your attorneys continuing to do a lot of work with businesses or individuals that are relocating out of California?
We do a lot of it. We're opening offices now. We have one in Denver that was the most recent opening, and then we're opening them across the southeast. So Nashville, Atlanta, and then Miami are in the works. And it's mostly because a lot of our client businesses are moving there. And I was with some of my colleagues over the weekend, and people were talking and commenting about how even the big conventions, there's a big clothing convention called Magic. Magic's now doing a convention in Nashville. And other places are starting to move to different locations that are just business friendly. They're making it easier for businesses to operate. You're seeing Oracle, Amazon, places move to, larger locations outside of California because those states are giving incentives, or they're just easier to operate in, generally speaking.
One of the things that I'm going to be fascinated to watch over the next couple of years is the mandate to move all trucking to away from diesel vehicles and gas, and the impact of that from an infrastructure standpoint and from a cost standpoint on businesses. I have a tendency to think that that's going to be another driving factor that's going to make it easier for people to want to do business out of state.
I would think so. And I mean, I think that there was a proposal just in last election to not allow any more industrial warehouse to be built inside of California because of the trucking issue. It didn't pass, but to your point, instead of taking away the ability to build industrial. You just take away the ability to operate the truck, and it kind of solves the same problem. So,
Yeah.
well, the same perceived issue. I'm not saying it's a problem, but.
All right, let's talk a little bit about, we got 10 minutes. We'll talk about some other commercial real estate items and issues. What transactions are you working on right now that you think are indicative of the current market?
Interesting. More complex items, seller carryback deals, more creative structuring and financing. Those tend to be very popular. Some distressed properties, certainly. And then I think a lot of what's driving us right now, and we have a couple of these are, everybody says when the market slows down, who's going to have business? Well, I think 10% of the market turns over roughly every year because of, death, divorce, separation of business, et cetera. So as you know, Justin, we have a few transactions that we're working on together where, parents of the kids had been partners for 40 years. Most of the parents have since passed away. The kids don't get along or like each other. And so we're selling the property so that the families can separate. It's two separate families can separate themselves and move on. There's a lot of those situations as well. Not a lot of 1031 anymore, some fresh capital, and then just people that think that they see real value in the market right now that are just moving on properties because they think that they're undervalued what they're being sold at.
Okay, I have an interesting question for somebody in the legal field, because you mentioned it a second ago about families.
Sure.
And in my experience over the course of my career, you see a lot of people that, there's 2 or 3 or 4 partners that bought a property in the, going to date myself here, 60s, 70s, or 80s. They're now in their 70s, 80s, 90s, or passed away. And what were 2 or 3 or 4 people is now 9 or 10 decision makers. And there was probably opportunity along the way when there were fewer partners to get everybody on board and structure transactions to go their separate ways. How much time and money does it cost somebody to, when there are 9 or 10 people, when there's different opinions, to get everybody on board and actually do a transaction? Like, and it's more, my question is from your standpoint, how frustrating is it when you see so many people involved that it only takes one person to not be on the same page, and that costs families so much additional money? It costs them time, it costs them emotional energy, it costs them opportunity cost. Like, talk about that a little bit, because I think that there's so much opportunity to avoid that early on. We got clients right now that none of them have passed. There's 3 of them. Their kids are involved, and they're going to do it now and go their separate ways. So there's only 1 or 2 people deciding in the next 10 years.
I think it's really difficult. So to operate in that context, I like when we're in those situations and there's, one side trying to sell it, I'd like to request, and it doesn't have to be me, but often each person has their own counsel, but that, kind of one counsel takes the lead. There's nothing more frustrating than, 7 different lawyers redlining the same document at the same time, and then everybody sending their red lines around. It makes more sense to have one person with 85% of the comments are the same on every single document, but yet each lawyer needs to feel the need or importance to get their billable hours in and do their work and show that they're adding value to their client, which becomes wildly frustrating. And then from there, it also is hard because designating someone that's kind of wrangle everybody and lead the decision and, be the driving force behind getting answers quickly. And oftentimes you'll get family law attorneys or other folks that aren't experienced in real estate transactions. And you've seen me do this on these deals recently where I'm sending out emails being like, we need to respond faster. We can't take 9 days in between, a counter offer to respond because everybody needs to get on the same page. And whether that's getting people. Right. We lose buyers or we lose, parties. And so it's like either we need to do a call right when the offer comes in within 24 hours, get everybody on the same page and turn it around. But then it's also just like when it's in a tick like that or multiple people, wrangling signatures becomes a problem. Right. And so it's not overly costly up front to just separate people out or set up a structure like, 3 partners each own their LLCs and just designate one family member to make a decision. So instead of having 12 kids, you have 3, right? Just narrowing it down and simplifying it is money well spent up front. Let's just put it that way.
How about we do the next one on how, let's call it, multi-person partnerships can structure their transactions or their ownership to make it easier for their future generations to not spend so much time and money when everybody goes their separate ways. I think that would maybe be the biggest financial saving webinar that we could do.
I agree. We had a transaction, Justin, where there was like 4 parties arguing, and I got hired by the trustee of one of the trusts. Even though the trust had its own real estate attorney, the trustee hired me to represent him to make sure that the legal was done correctly because everybody was fighting so much.
It's a bummer, and like the weird part or the sad part is often because you said somebody then tries to run with the ball and just make it work for everybody, and usually that person has really good intentions. But if there's 6, 7, or 8 people involved, usually one of the other 6 or 7 thinks that person's got the wrong intentions. And even if it doesn't matter what is suggested or recommended, they just say no.
Correct. And then you also have a lawyer with each person, which then you're starting to deal with lawyer egos and, who has more experience or
your commentary on lawyers today is
I'm
going to save all of these and just create little clips to play back to you.
I fall into that habit occasionally where I'm like, no, we need to take our stand on this one point. And in reality, it's probably not that big of an issue. I try not to, but it happens. We should take 30 seconds and talk about that property sale in the city of LA that went down about a week ago.
So let's do it. What we're going to talk about for you, and I'll let Jason give you some of the details. Actually, one of the best people I've met in the business is now an owner. He started out as an agent, or didn't start out, but I met him as a new agent at Marcus and Millichap. Guy worked super hard, great guy. Spent a little bit of time there, then got into development, and he's doing some really fantastic projects. And these two are really, really, really nice, high quality buildings in LA. Big properties. I think it was 71 units. Transaction goes for close to $30 million. So 471 or 81 units a door at a time in the market where, there's not a lot of things happening. Jason, you want to finish off the details of the story and the irony of the transaction?
Sure. So the buyer was the housing authority of the city of Los Angeles. There was no mansion tax applied because they were the buyer. So it was negotiated that the city wouldn't enforce its own mansion tax on the deal.
No. I'm actually going to jump in. I don't think that was negotiated. I believe that a provision of the mansion tax is that if it is a public entity buying it, it doesn't apply.
Even better.
Or a public entity selling it.
But remember that saved them. So it was a $30 million transaction. It saved them 1.7-ish million. They also did the transaction without brokers. So let's say another 5%. They saved about $3.25 million, and they sold it at $415 a door for 71 units to the city.
So the city buys it. You just mentioned what city agency bought it. What's the intention?
Probably transitional homeless housing. So it's going to be homeless housing, but it's going to be probably as part of a program that they're going to try to transition people from homelessness to, productive members of society. So
Project Room Key, I think, is what they call it, or is
correct. Let's
call it the common name that cities use for it. I actually just read an article the other day that the city of Los Angeles has a big appetite for it. City of Long Beach does as well, but we're struggling to find what had been the typical or what they were buying a lot of, which were motels, small hotels to use for housing. And now they're buying, in this case, the city of LA, Class A.
They're really nice buildings. Like if you look at them, they're really nice buildings.
Yeah. I saw the pictures of it. They do good work. Those guys do really good work on their developments. Jason, it's been a pleasure. I always enjoy it when we do this and we catch up and we talk about the things that we're seeing in the marketplace. Thought that was a great thing to finish on. For those of you that have any questions regarding, let's call it real estate related issues and the law, our clients have had a great opportunity to use Jason and his expertise. You could probably tell from his comments or at least observations. He's a different type of professional in his space. And I've always found him to really want to help the client and do a great job and provide them the right answers, whether that means it's on the bill or it's just because you called and he can answer your question quickly. He's fantastic. So Jason, thanks again for all the work you do for our clients and on behalf of Centennial over there at Buckhalter with your team. As we've said, the next webinar that we will do, we'll talk about structuring your ownership to make it as easy as possible for yourself and or future generations and your heirs to work through divesting of partnerships. And let's call it communal ownership of real estate. Thanks again, Jason. It's been awesome.
Thanks for having me.